action.
Hello everyone, my name is Amy Lykover. I'm the president of the Federation of San Rafael Neighborhoods. I'd like to welcome all of you here and ask you if you've signed in yet. Michael McDermott is there, Ross Bishop is there. We'd like you to sign in and become part of our growing organization. The Federation of San Rafael Neighborhoods is a group of volunteers that tries to pull together meeting topics that are of interest to our membership, and so we're always open for ideas. And I'd first like to start by just thanking the people from BioMarin who are have been so gracious in allowing us to use their room. So Carly Davis, did I get your last name right? Daniels, Carly Daniels, and Josh Townsend, who interfaces with us. Thank you so much. And then Ross Bishop is at the back. Ross is the Federation Steering Committee member who came up with this idea because he lives in Spinnaker Point, and I know a number of you are here from Spinnaker Point. Just raise your hand if you're here from Spinnaker Point, and then raise your hand if you're here from North San Rafael along the bay, so North San Pedro Road, etc. I know there's a number of you. That's great. Needless to say, the rest of us are also at risk, and that's one reason why you're here. We'll be thanking our guests as they speak, but before we do, would you just say your names, steering committee members, and just wave so that you know, in addition to me and to Ross Bishop, Michael McDermott over here who helped you sign in, Jim Draper who's doing the videoing and the tech, Mike Williamson over there, Kevin Haggerty over there. Did I miss anyone? We have about 5 other people who are unavailable today, but really it's just a great steering committee. So with that, make sure that you help yourself to cookies and water, and yeah, we're going to be contacting you too to see if you'd like to join our organization. We charge $10 a year, it's really nothing, and we want to be able to grow and pay me for my ingredients, my cooking ingredients. All right, enough about that. Let me pass the parole to Ross, who's going to introduce the speakers.
Greetings.
Greetings.
This is not camp. So yeah, I'm Ross Bishop. I'm on the steering committee for the Federation. I live in Spinnaker Point. I'm actually the HOA president over there as well. So this is an important topic to everybody that lives along the 10 miles of coastline that city of San Rafael has. But as Amy points out, it's a big topic for everybody. That's why we're all here, because we know that. So we're fortunate today to have an incredible panel of people to tell us a lot of great information, both at a city level, from a planning department, from hydrology, and also at the county level, and also at the civic level. So we have a lot of great panelists, and so I'm just going to introduce them just briefly. So Corey Bytoff is the sustainability program program manager. I just was trying to memorize these, so I'm going to see how I do here. He's going to be a tremendous resource. Paul Jenner is the Paul Jensen. That's right.
We just call them Corey and Paul.
Corey and Paul. Everybody knows your first names. Yeah. He's the director of the community development department, and so he's working for the city of San Rafael as well. And then we have Jeff Rhodes, who is the president of the Argonaut Company. They provide design and planning services for the Resilient Shore organization. And
he's also the executive director of that.
Well, there you go. That's not in his bio.
Oh, okay.
And then Chris Chu. Chris Chu is the senior watershed planner for Marin County. So this collection of, and also Matt Brennan is a new ad, and so he's a senior engineering hydrologist, and he's working for, the city Environmental Services Agency. Yeah. Right. So he works for ESA, and so so we have actually 5 people giving brief presentations, so we want to let them go through and show you this topic from a variety of points of view. This is important to a lot of people. And then when they're done, we're going to have a question and answer session, and we're going to look to wrap up around 8:30. So this should be hugely informative with a really high quality panel, and so we'll invite your participation and your questions. So we're going to start out with Chris, and she's going to come up and speak to you from the county standpoint with regard to the sea level rise.
All right. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Chris Chu. I'm here from Marin County. I work in the Department of Public Works, and I am a planner, helping to plan for sea level rise along the Marin Bay shoreline. We have two programs, one for the coast and one for the bay, and I lead the work on our bay program. So for the folks in the room right now, are most folks pretty familiar with sea level rise? Just generally show of hands, yes. Are folks familiar with impacts to their local homes and their community generally? Yes? Okay. So hopefully this won't be a complete repeat for all of you. I was asked to just provide some summary information on what the county's doing. So I'm starting out by letting you know that we did complete a vulnerability assessment. It was completed in 2017. It's been out for quite a while, and it includes an assessment of the entire bay shoreline, and it looks at 6 different scenarios. You can go, it's very comprehensive, and it looks a lot like this. It's a giant document, it's about that big, but it mostly is photos, graphs, charts, and maps, and it outlines the different impacts for sea level rise for 6 different scenarios. Includes an assessment by community, so San Rafael versus Novato, but it also looks at things by assets. And so, you know, whether that's transportation or emergency services, parcels and buildings, it looks at it through a number of different lenses. This is San Rafael, and the map basically shows the buildings that are threatened under different sea level rise scenarios. The red ones being first and the blue ones being furthest along with 96 inches of sea level rise. And again, this is all available online. It's all available actually at Marin SLR for marinsealevelrise.org. And this is looking at the transportation assets. And so sea level rise for most people isn't a surprise now. It was probably far more of a surprise back in 2017. But especially in Marin County, I think it's not a huge surprise that sea level rise will mean impacts for the communities. These are a number of photos going back to, I think, 82, 83, all the way to some fairly recent photos at China Camp. But we're used to flooding. We built our communities here in Marin very close to the bay, oftentimes in what used to be baylands. And so that creates a lot of complex challenges in trying to keep water out. I don't think I need to explain where all the photos are taken, but that's San Francisco at the top, Wayne. Which I think is now
Wayne Cross Ford, that's
dealership.
now Toyota.
Toyota. Okay, I always get that confused. At the top is China Camp and North San Pedro Road, and at the bottom, the church photos in Santa Venetia, and then Jackson's Hardware is on the other side. And so all San Rafael photos, more or less, unincorporated and incorporated. And then I use this slide to kind of say 2 things. One, we don't know exactly how much sea level rise is going to happen and when. It depends on a lot of things that we do. It depends on a lot of things that the world as a whole does to help reduce kind of some of the factors, the carbon emissions factors, the greenhouse gas emissions, so that we can hopefully change this scenario. But the state in its last guidance to all of us asked us to plan for up to 10 feet. In Marin, that's almost impossible to plan for. But we try and plan for something in between this, and we use kind of our flood experience as a place to start and think about how we can help reduce the flood risk as well as prepare ourselves for sea level rise. And then I wanted to share a little bit of the adaptation measures, and I know Matt will get into this, I think, in more detail, but the adaptation measures for sea level rise are not that different from what we have for flooding. We have a whole bunch of really popular nature-based measures that are being talked about a lot. I know that folks have heard about the horizontal levee or the ecotone levee. It's basically your standard levee, but with a very long, low slope grade on one side that allows for vegetation and animals to basically move up. The rest of these are probably fairly familiar: wetlands, marshes, detention basins or ponds, beaches, and then things that you can do. Okay, just went black on my side. Things you can do that can help reduce some of the impacts of waves and and of some of that water, but it doesn't prevent water from coming over, especially when we talk about a lot of flooding at once. And so then the engineering measures are those that we're fairly used to. I think there's a lot of examples of those around San Rafael: levees, walls, pump stations. And then we have regulatory, financial, and policy tools, which we're starting to look at as ways to think about how we can plan long term. Those range from rolling easements, building restrictions, policy changes, all sorts of different tools that can be used, knowing that this threat is coming, to both help plan for our communities, but also to help protect private landowners to some degree. And then just to wrap up, I wanted to mention, so we completed the vulnerability assessment, and that was back in 2017. It's now 2019. What we're doing now is quite a bit towards adaptation. Most of my time and effort is working with our local cities and towns, trying to increase coordination, provide tools, find data gaps and try and fill them. And so we have a couple of projects that we've been working on that kind of start to show what adaptation measures we're taking. We have a lot of restoration projects that we're working on across the county, both in Public Works as well as with our Parks Department, McInnes, both Thien Marsh, Deer Island Basin in Novato, Ciscornia, which Barbara Salzman and Marin Audubon just got funded for. But we're also working on an adaptation framework that looks at what those nature-based solutions can do and what they really can't do. And so we looked at the entire Bay shoreline and looked at nature-based options and exactly how much sea level rise they help offset. So that report should actually be launched fairly widely and publicly at the end of this month. And it's a report that we did with SFEI and Point Blue. We have adaptation land use planning. We have a guidance document that we are actually going back to the cities and towns, to the planning directors, to share. All of the city planning directors actually help guide what we put into that guidance document, and it's really looking at the big scale, trying to coordinate across the jurisdictions, thinking about what land use tools make sense in this county, because we're not Texas, we're not New Jersey. We can't easily buy out hundreds of homeowners in flooded areas. But we can try and use some of the planning tools that are available that have been used in this county, perhaps to help us plan for sea level rise. And then we have some public works projects that are actually pretty exciting. We're looking at kind of how we do the work that we do. So I work in public works. We're working with all the other cities and towns and looking at what can be done in the short term and kind of over the long term to help protect our roads, our emergency services. How do we work with fire to make sure that our main roads are accessible for them during emergencies, but also for all of us to get in and out. So we're looking at kind of elevations as well as routes to and from hospitals to fire stations, to a lot of our kind of necessary emergency services, to look at adaptation options that could help reduce some of the delays and some of the isolated communities during those emergencies. And I think that's it for my quick overview of what the county's doing, and then I'll be around at the end for questions.
Thank you. Ross, should we hold questions until we're done with all the presentations?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's give a round of applause. Come on. Really appreciate it.
I know this looks a little pedestrian compared to her slides, but it'll work.
This is what's really going to happen.
I have to first say that I spent the entire day in 3 meetings on the topic of housing. So I don't know whether this is more daunting or that topic is more daunting, but I'm here to talk about sea level rise on behalf of the city. My name is Paul Jensen, and this is a topic area that I really like, and we are working on it as part of our general plan update. But before we go there, what I want to do is I want to step back and tell you where we started with this topic. And we adopted a climate change action plan back in 2009, and that was when the whole topic of sea level rise was taken seriously by the city. Although there were a lot of unknowns about this topic back then, but what we did know is that we needed to do a levee analysis in our city because we don't have levees that are certified for even flood protection. I mean, we have some that are newer levees that do protect the neighborhoods, but We built that into our climate change action plan, and also to proceed with a vulnerability assessment. And as Chris had mentioned, we were fortunate enough to participate in Baywave, which I'm going to mention in a few minutes. Following that effort, we prepared a white paper, which, by the way, is available on our website. This was our first attempt to take a look at this at a more granular level. This white paper was a first step at addressing the Climate Change Action Plan. It's an informational document. It's not a technical study, but what it did do was gather a bunch of information on the topic of sea level rise from various sources that were available at that time, and also to describe some of the adaptation measures that Chris had mentioned in her Baywave presentation. And we also took an attempt to look at opportunity areas for adaptation, and I'm going to touch on that in a few minutes. And this will just give you an idea generally of some of the areas that are most vulnerable to sea level rise in San Rafael. And San Rafael is like the test case for sea level rise central. We have a lot of conditions in the city that make certain areas vulnerable. And I'm just going to quickly go through these areas. We have the greater part of the central and southeast San Rafael area, which includes the Canal, Spinnaker Point, Francisco Boulevard, Anderson Drive. A lot of this area, if you look at old historic aerial photos, was basically part of the bay or part of the San Rafael Creek Channel. So it's logical to think, okay, these are areas that are going to get flooded because they were filled over the years, and they're not at extremely high elevations. Another area that is vulnerable is our San Rafael Canal, of course. Large sections of the East San Rafael area, which is the San Pedro Peninsula. We have, like the Peacock Gap Golf Course, that area is very vulnerable to sea level rise. And then we have portions of North San Rafael, a lot of which are within the county. This will just give you an idea of generally what we're talking about. Spinnaker Point, for example, is one of the vulnerable areas. This is the levee front along the bay front of Spinnaker Point. It is not high enough to accommodate sea level rise. The inner canal area, we have areas like the Central Canal neighborhood that's vulnerable to sea level rise, like this apartment building that was built back in the 1960s. San Pedro Peninsula, a lot of you who live out on the peninsula is very familiar with the seawall, which is great until we have an extreme storm event and a king tide, where we have seen, of course, this area get topped. And I'm just old enough to remember the 1981 storm event where the whole mountain came down and basically flooded this area. So this is one area that is definitely vulnerable. And then lastly, we have the Galenas Creek Basin north of the hill. We have areas such as Contempo Marin Mobile Home Park, which are in low-lying portions of that basin that are vulnerable to sea level rise. So as Chris mentioned, the city of San Rafael, like other cities and towns in Marin along the bayfront, participated in Baywave. We are so fortunate that the county took the lead on this effort and provided the level of information that we've got for the San Rafael area on a number of different topic areas and assets. It was something, if we undertook on our own, I think we probably would still be struggling with that effort. So that's a big piece of what we needed to get done, and it's the foundation for our planning for sea level rise. So we're very appreciative of the county having taken the lead on that. But what I did want to mention is, in addition to Baywave, there have been a number of other things that have transpired since the Baywave effort. One I'm going to mention is Resilient by Design. I don't know if any of you have heard about this, but it was a design competition that was sponsored by the Rockefeller Institute. And San Rafael was one of 10 areas selected in the Bay to study sea level rise. A group called the Bionic Team tackled that. If you look at that, it will scare you, because some of the things they recommend is like retreat, which is like complete returning areas like the Canal neighborhood and most of East San Rafael to tidal action. But there are some very, very good short-term recommendations that are in that design study that was done that we are going to use, and Matt will from ESA will be explaining some of the things that they're studying which came out of that study. I want to mention our local hazard mitigation plan. That's something that we adopted in the last year. That is more of a global study of not only looking at things like flooding, but fire protection, or excuse me, fire hazard. And so whatever we do with sea level rise will ultimately make its way into this plan as amended. I'm going to mention Measure AA. This is a tax. Each of us who own property pay a tax. I think it's $12 a year that go into this fund that generates about $25 million annually for habitat restoration. Chris mentioned the Tiscornia Marsh Project. They were beneficiaries of this Measure AA grant last year. And so that will be something that will be available every year to help fund adaptation projects. Corey Bidoff is going to report on our update of our climate change action plan, which was just adopted earlier this year. Matt from Environmental Science Associates has been hired by the city. They're looking at some short-term adaptation measures for the city, as well as sort of a deeper dive on the Bay Wave effort. And then I'm going to touch on next our General Plan 2040. I don't know if everyone's familiar with the general plan, but every city and town and county in California has to prepare a general plan for the city. And it's basically a forecast, generally over a 20-year period. We currently operate under what's called General Plan 2020, so it's due to sunset in 2020. And so the timing is perfect for us to update this general plan and that this topic area be incorporated into our general plan update. Right now, we have some bare minimum programs in the general plan dealing with the topic of sea level rise, but we have some tools now that are available to us that will help us to do more than that as part of this effort. What I want you to know is right now what we're doing in our general plan is we're focusing on 3 different things for addressing this issue. One is awareness and disclosure, much like what FEMA does with the flood mapping. The second is a framework for regulations, and that is, let's say, a construction elevation for development moving forward. And then third, preparing for adaptation planning. And that is basically a follow-up to Bay Wave. What we're looking at right now is there are several milestones of predictions. You saw this chart that Chris had in her presentation about predictions over certain periods of time. There are 2 primary milestones or benchmarks. One is 2050, and the second one, which is far into the future, which is 2100. What we're going to be doing for our General Plan 2040, because our General Plan 2040 is for a forecast through year 2040, is we're going to be using the 2050 predictions as our base. But we're doing this with some caution. Because the 2100 predictions for sea level rise are so speculative, what we want to do is we can't overplan for our general plan. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the 2050 predictions, but we're going to revisit that every 5 years. So as new information becomes available, if things become worse or not as extreme as we expect, we'll be able to adjust that over time. So what will we include in this general plan effort? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to include a sea level rise map. This is something that most communities haven't done, so we're kind of going outside the box here. And as I mentioned, this map will assume a 2050 prediction. Where this map lies in our general plan is still yet to be determined. It's likely going to be in what's called our safety element, but it might also be in our land use element. We have a land use map that identifies land use for the entire community, but the intent is to use this as a supplement for moving forward. And the map will be used for a number of things. As I mentioned, public awareness and disclosure. So if people come in and they want to buy property in an area, they look at a map, much like they look at the FEMA flood maps and say, okay, this is an area where we're vulnerable to sea level rise. Do we want to take the risk of buying property here? The second, it will be used and adopted as an overlay zone so that as we look at planning projects moving ahead, this will be something that we will consider in reviewing land development projects and also for construction. One of the things that we are looking at is a minimum elevation requirement for construction in areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise. And then also the map will be used for planning for adaptation. And we have, as I mentioned in the white paper that we prepared, we identified a number of areas of opportunity for adaptation and certain types of adaptation. And Matt is actually going to touch on some of those in part of his presentation. And lastly, I think this is a real important component, financing and funding, because if we plan for and we need to protect a lot of these areas, putting in seawalls, putting in horizontal levees, raising the levee, things of that nature, that's all going to cost a lot of money. So we have to find a way to finance this, and the map area will provide us an opportunity for looking at things like a bond measure or assessment district or whatever. And I can tell you, these adaptation measures are going to be done in increments. They're not going to be, everything can't be done at once. There's just there's no way to do it that way. So let's see, what else? Okay, I mentioned the prediction map. We are also preparing as part of our general plan what we're calling an adaptation report. And basically what that will do is it will identify best practices, the toolbox of the adaptation measures that are appropriate for San Rafael, a toolbox of some of the financial measures, and then also to identify some of the opportunity areas for adaptation. And I do want to touch on that because there are generally 4 areas, and Chris mentioned these. There's retreat, that's basically returning an area to tidal action. Armoring, which is raising or improving a levee, barriers such as seawalls and breakwaters, and then lastly, living shorelines or horizontal levees. These are improvements that occur bayside of, let's say, the levee along the East San Rafael shoreline. So I'm going to touch on some of these areas. Canalways, this is one opportunity. I don't know if you're familiar with the Canalways property, but it's the last remaining undeveloped site in the East San Rafael area. It's about 85 acres. Most of it is, a lot of it is below sea level. This is an opportunity area. It could be a combination of retreat or reinforcing this levee. Another is the Pickleweed Park Dike Baylands. This is the area that's behind Pickleweed Park and the playfields and west of the Tiscornia Marsh. In fact, this area is being incorporated into the Tiscornia Marsh restoration. The thought is to return this area to tidal action, so it's basically the retreat method, and then reinforcing a new levee around the Pickleweed and Albert Borough Center. The East San Rafael mudflats offer an opportunity for horizontal levee, and Jeff Rhodes is going to explain his vision for this area. Mahone Creek in downtown has some opportunities. This creek channel could be widened. If you see to the right, there's this ledge area that was originally intended for a seasonal marsh. It never took. So one opportunity is to widen this channel so that there's more storage capacity for water. Glenwood and Peacock Gap, I mentioned the seawall. There's obviously some opportunities for raising that seawall or perhaps raising the road out in that area, and some offshore improvements. And the San Rafael Rock Quarry also has some opportunities. And interestingly, the rock quarry, that quarry is likely to close during the forecast period of our next general plan update, which means that they may be planning ahead to redevelop that rock quarry, and the large pit area and this field that you see are opportunities for retreat, for returning to tidal action. So our general plan is also going to include some policies and implementing programs. I mentioned the map, obviously, awareness and disclosure. a minimum construction elevation, and then preparation of an adaptation plan will be one of our programs moving forward. And I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Corey to explain his work.
We are so lucky to have people that know this stuff so well that we can rely on. I, on the other hand, am a toe dipper. Most of my work is on our climate change action plan, which is implementing it, which is around mitigation. It's about reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. So everyone needs to do their part, and San Rafael has a plan to do that. But we do have some adaptation measures in there. Earlier this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report that said basically, look, we've got 1 degree Celsius rise so far. That's very firm. We've got to hold the line to 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature in order to stave off the worst effects of climate change, and that we need to slash emissions dramatically, including reaching net zero, which means basically no net emissions. The Paris Agreement was set up to address a lot of these concerns. Any guesses on the Paris Agreement, if all the nations met their obligations under that, whether we would get to that 1.5 degrees or not, or any? Basically 3 degrees increase if they meet everything that's in that pact. So we've got a lot of work to do. In our climate change action plan, we set a target for this new round for a 40% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. I always like to ask, and I was here a few months ago, I already asked this question, so half of you may have heard this. Have you ever tried to reduce anything in your life by 40%? That is not an easy task. And the city of San Rafael's emissions as a government agency are 1% of our community greenhouse gas emissions. So we have direct control over 1%. So we need everybody at the table and everybody involved, much like with adaptation planning, everyone's going to need to be at the table. So this chart basically shows you what the plans are. The red line shows you business as usual. That basically says greenhouse gas emissions, if we did nothing, would probably stay about flat just because the state is doing so much and technology and all these other things are happening. But if we want to get to the first dot, which is 25% reduction by 2020, we've got some work to do. Our 2016 greenhouse gas inventory said we're about 18% reduction right now, so we're getting pretty close. I don't have confirmed, but our latest greenhouse gas inventory preliminarily shows at about 24% emissions reduction, so that's pretty good. But we got to head toward that 40% and then toward 80% reduction by 2050, which is what scientists were saying we needed to do. In our climate action plan, it has a whole bunch of measures all around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but there are a few to pay attention to. The last 3 down there, sequestration and adaptation, that's where we put in some measures around this whole adaptation piece. We didn't want to go deep into adaptation planning in this. This climate action plan took 1.5 years to do as it was. Adaptation planning is going to take multi-years and a lot of community engagement. But we did set some commitments in there. Community engagement just recognizes that piece about all of us need to be involved. And so more and more community engagement is going to need to happen if we're going to meet our goals, whether that's emissions reduction or adaptation planning. And then implementation and monitoring is basically just our commitment to continue on, to not just have a shelf plan. So the commitments that I've mentioned in the sequestration and adaptation piece, does everybody know what sequestration means? Yeah, generally? Okay, sequestration is basically drawing carbon back down into the earth. So you know that trees are supposed to be good for climate change, right? They're supposed to suck the carbon back out of the atmosphere and put it back into the earth. There's a great program in West Marin called the Marin Carbon Project, and what they're doing is they're using rangelands and grasslands and they're fortifying it with compost, and they're finding that the natural native plants are growing and they're sucking down carbon way faster than trees even. So there's lots of technologies out there, a lot of people are looking at that, and 85% of our land is off limits to development. So we've got a lot of potential to be able to do that as we start to learn more about how to do that. But adaptation, basically what we did was we said, look, let's include some things in the general plan, in our capital improvement plan, and let's commit to a long-term adaptation planning strategy. So our timeline is to start looking for funding for that sometime this fall or winter, with the idea that maybe sometime next year we can get started with that. And again, it's going to be a huge community engagement process. It's going to be a major public-private partnership here because we're all in it together, and there's going to be a lot of tough choices we're going to have to make. So I'll just mention a few things about the Resilient by Design Challenge. Paul mentioned it a little earlier. The Bionic team did choose San Rafael. What they recognized was that San Rafael is a hub. We're one of the 4 major hubs in the Bay Area where all kinds of traffic passes through, all kinds of commerce passes through, people pass through. It's a very important piece. It's the end of a bridge. It's a gateway to Sonoma and Northern California. And that San Rafael has both vulnerabilities and opportunities there because we're an important piece in regional planning as well. So they set out a couple of paths, a near-term path and a long-term path with the basic idea that whatever you do for the short term, don't diverge too far from a long-term plan because you don't want to have to make it up later. It was a mix of local, regional, private, and public entities and opportunities that they looked at. Right now, the program is done. We do have it. You can go at resilientbayarea.org and click on the San Rafael, Elevate San Rafael. There's about a 25-minute presentation where they go through all the slides, and in 25 minutes, you'll get the whole gist of what they were looking at. Right now, they have a pro bono set of folks in a finance committee that are willing to work with some of the cities and agencies that were involved in Resilient by Design, and we're very fortunate to be able to participate with them. And what they're doing is looking at, are there portfolios of different funding that can be put together? How do we look at it in the big picture and try to understand all the funding opportunities? And they're a pretty interesting group of folks from academia and private sector finance companies, and so we're participating with them in the long term to try to understand what that might look like for San Rafael projects. And then one of the near-term projects that they proposed was a Pickleweed Park design project. And so I'll go into that in just a little bit, but here's a few slides from Elevate San Rafael. You can see that that's just sort of identifying where we are in the region and how important it is, and the 2 major freeways that come through San Rafael. Their big focus was on, we got to learn to live with water. And so we should really be educating people about water, about the Bay, about all the assets there and all the things that it can provide for people, and provide connections to that, as well as look at the types of, again, the levees, or these are eelgrass and oyster bed projects that are happening in San Rafael right now, and build off of the things that we're already doing in the Bay. And then this near-term project is this Pickleweed Park project, which is to turn it into a resiliency hub. So these are some of the things that the Resilient by Design proposed for us, was to really start to move away from our current reliance on pumps and pump systems. They're just not going to work when sea levels rise. Upgrade to floodable buildings. There are other places in the world that really, they build their buildings to live with water. Acquiring property for infrastructure protection, and to make sure that we provide equitable housing still, especially with number 5, retreat where necessary, that Paul was talking about. And then city-scale apparatus of green infrastructure, which I don't even know what that means. But I'm sure some of these folks will. Jeff will probably talk a little bit more about that. So here's the Catalyst project. The idea is, look, we've got a park, we've got a community center that's really well used. It's one of the most used parks and community centers in the county. So it's a place where people know. It's right adjacent to the water. You have those opportunities to interface with the water and to educate about the water and get people to have leisure time in the water. And you could also build it as a resiliency hub, so that right now it's not in a position to really receive a lot of people should a disaster happen, but it could be. And so that's one of the short-term projects that we're looking at, and we're looking for some funding for that as well. And then one other thing I just wanted to note, Paul mentioned the local hazard mitigation plan. One other thing that we're doing, which is not related to sea level rise, is we're working with a professor from Chico who's taken a sabbatical to help students at the Marin School of Environmental Leadership work with a city to develop some other hazard plans, as they're going to be working on an extreme heat preparedness plan, and that will hopefully get into the general plan as well. And here's some examples of some of the students. These kids, they come in 9th grade and they look like little pipsqueaks. By the time they're done with 9th grade, they're speaking to city council and flipping votes, so it's a pretty amazing school.
These are kids from Terralinda High School.
Yeah. So here's my message. One of the things that Ross had suggested was, what can people do? And so, getting involved is super important. I know you all probably all know about the CERT program. If you haven't taken it, take it. It's really important because you're going to be on your own, right? And it's going to be important to know your neighbors and to have some plans together. We have our Climate Change Action Plan quarterly meetings that happen the 3rd Thursday of the month from 4 to 6. January, April, July, and October. So when we start the adaptation planning, that's one of the places where we're going to have a lot of interaction and a lot of input. Resilient Neighborhoods is a great program that helps you reduce your carbon footprint, and they have a whole disaster planning piece as well. So be able to get your family safe and make sure you have the right supplies and all that. And it's a behavior change program, so whereas a lot of us learn things in these meetings and then we go back and don't do anything about them, these meetings you actually do them. People really come through and end up with their kits and their go bags and all that good stuff. And then of course, pay attention to council meetings, watch them online, come visit and speak up as well. So that's my presentation. We'll leave the questions for later and we'll go into ESA. Thank you.
Pretty good for a toe dipper, huh?
No, it's not what it's over. Is there one under the under slideshow, the menu option? Oh, there's a little resume thing. Somehow it got. I don't know where that came from. Maybe now do from the beginning there. Same. That's like a mystery button. I don't know what that thing is.
Close it and then reopen it.
That seems like it. Where'd the cursor go?
Excuse me, Corey?
Yeah?
Sorry, I was a little bit late. Are you going to have these presentations available for people who attended this meeting?
Yes, we have them videoed right now,
Okay.
Oh, but we could provide
and the presentations themselves
hard copy, sure.
we could post.
There
Definitely.
we go. All right.
It's too high tech.
Thank you, Corey. My name is Matt Brennan. I'm an engineering hydrologist, means I sort of straddle the two sides between the where wet things happen, like the edge of the bay, and work on the engineering piece as well. So take a lot of the good visioning work that the other presenters have talked about at sort of the high altitude level and start to drill down into thinking about the actual projects going in the ground and how big would they be and how much they cost and those sorts of things. So on behalf of that, we're working with the city's Department of Public Works to develop an adaptation plan to sort of cover the more engineering side to sort of complement the general plan part that Paul was talking about. So this is to sort of give the city a specific plan for sort of thinking about what adaptation measures are coming on the horizon, how those address the flood risk that the community faces, make these adaptation measures sort of appropriate for the areas in the particular facets of the San Rafael shoreline, evaluate them again kind of in that engineering mathematical cost side to it, and think about how to sort of build them and put them together into a plan that sort of rolls out in these phases as Paul was talking about. One place I like to start, just because it is the sort of the benchmark for flooding, and in the case particularly of San Rafael, because of San Rafael being sort of these valleys in between high hillsides, is with the FEMA floodplain map. So this one's got the acronym up there of the SFHA, which is a Special Flood Hazard Map. Of course, everything in government speak needs a nice acronym, right, Kathy?
Yes.
Most people know it more as like the flood map, the FEMA map, the 1% floodplain map. It's got kind of lots of names. But this provides lots of good engineering technical basis from which to build up adaptations to sea level rise. Although FEMA doesn't immediately require you to address sea level rise, it's got lots of good technical information to start from. So I thought I'd just start with that. The areas in blue are what are called the FEMA floodplain, which is either the 100-year flood or the 1% annual chance flood. Inland, most of those have pretty constant values at the city scale, although they sort of vary across the bay. If you look at detail along the shoreline, you'll see actually the zones along the shoreline itself where you'd actually have to design flood protection measures vary by a couple feet around the city's shoreline. And that's because FEMA in its recent remapping effort took into consideration not just the base water level of the bay, but also the waves and the way they interact with the shoreline and can run up and cause additional hazard. So you can see something like if you're on the backside of the Richmond San Rafael bridge landing, it's kind of protected from waves. There, the base flood level is only 10 feet because it doesn't have an additional impact of waves. Whereas if you move around the shoreline or are exposed to sort of the larger stretches of bay in front of you, towards the north part of the city, then you start to get exposed to different amounts and larger wave exposure. It also depends a little bit on sort of the shape of your shoreline as well. One of the key pieces that comes with this of how to plan and how to engineer for these things are what's just that still flood water level. And so here I have that for certain return intervals. So return intervals give you an idea of how often is it going to occur, how much of a risk do I have to worry about for these particular events. And so I've included some very common ones which go from daily, which would be your high tides, down to your 1 year event that people is about what people talk about when they talk about a king tide, sort of what happens on a worst case once a year. Then I'm going to skip down, then there's like a 10 year and 100 years. So I find people, it's useful to have those just sort of, you know, round multiples of 10 increments in their heads. The 100 year refers to is what FEMA uses for its flood mapping, is all the way down there at the bottom. And then I also show 2 columns of where the data is coming from. We've had some San Rafael specific data that we collected as part of the Tiscornia Marsh project we're working on designing. And with that data, we validated San Rafael is agreeing very closely with San Francisco, which is great because San Francisco actually has the longest, at the Golden Gate, has the longest tide record in the country. So it gives you a way to look back in history, see how much sea level rise we've had, and see how much we have going forward, and also what the range of these storms are. And then also give you a sense for those who've been sort of around the last couple of years, the 2 wettest events we had in 2017, 2019, you'll see were about 7.9 feet, kind of just below a 10-year event. So 10-year is like a probabilistic thing. It's like, you know, means it happens exactly every 10 years. But it gives you an idea that, you know, every couple of years or so, you're facing events like that where you're sort of looking around and going, whoa, that was kind of close. That was a little bit scary. Like there was, you know, serious flooding pictures on the front page of the newspaper. And we sort of may have just walked away from that by the skin of our teeth. So now I want to take those and look at those return intervals, which are sort of in the columns going down, and then think about what those mean with sea level rise. So the first column of 0 sea level rise are the same numbers I had from the last page. If you look at those and sort of round to the nearest foot, you'll see that they're about a foot apart in increments. So it gives you an idea of sort of how much worse things get when you sort of move up these ladders in this risk exposure, right? At a daily level, okay, a 6-foot level. Once a year, we're going to see water levels about a foot higher at 7 feet. Every 10 years, a foot higher than that at 8 feet. And every 100 years, you know, a foot higher than that at 9.5, roughly, or as FEMA rounds it up to 10. And so that works nicely then with sea level rise to give you a sort of place of where are we going to be with how much sea level rise and how much worse will things get. If you keep it in those foot increments, because what it means is if you think about just 1 foot of sea level rise, means that the event that we think of as the 1 year event now, the one that's the king tide that sort of has people looking out the windows, maybe something's going to happen, it's going to be happening on a daily basis. The 10-year event, that one that kind of is, you know, people are sort of gripping the edge of the table, is going to be more like the king tide happening once a year. And the 100-year event is going to be more like those events that are the ones that happen every time. And you can see that, you know, this sort of marches across the table. So with just 2 feet of sea level rise, we're talking about something that's the 10-year event, the sort of, you know, right now people gripping and paying attention and talking Stormageddon is happening like almost every day with every high tide. So to give you sort of sense of, you know, even though when you get to the really high levels of sea level rise, those are certainly scary, but even in these short-term ones, we're talking about a significant shift in the way in which the shoreline is going to be exposed to flooding, even after only the first foot or 2 of sea level rise. And so even with just 3 feet of sea level rise, you're talking that the 100-year event, the one that really never happens, but is, you know, hopefully the one that doesn't happen too often, that blue floodplain map one that's in the bottom, is actually happening as your everyday event. One more piece is sort of put these sea level rises relative to some of the topography or the ground surface in San Rafael. So where this profile land surface elevation is in the main part of the plot is taken from that white line that's in the top part of the plot. So if you can recognize that, that's sort of right around the sort of north part of Spinnaker Point. The line starts over in the inner part of the canal and sort of loops around. So then, So again, this is over in Canal. We're going to follow this white line as if you walked it with a surveyor out to Spinnaker. And so collecting those elevations is what this line shows down here for the ground surface. All right, and then it has a few benchmarks for some of the street crossings. So if we take those water levels that I talked about, the still water levels without the waves are what's faced on the canal side. So you can see there the canal levees. This is data that doesn't quite capture all the tops. It's kind of right around that edge of like the 1 to 10 year things are starting to look risky on the canal side. As I mentioned before, on the outer bay side, because of the waves, the water levels, those same 1, 10, and 100-year water levels are higher. So over on Spinnaker, you find the levees higher in response to that. But then taking those numbers that I was talking about in the future, you start to see with just a foot of sea level rise, you know, now, like I said, what used to be the 10-year event was sort of everyone's maybe comfort level has moved up above the levee tops. And certainly with 2 feet of sea level rise, you're at a case where, you know, things are starting to look pretty tenuous. That's kind of the background hazard piece of where it is. Now I'm going to go maybe the part about like what do you do about it. So as part of this, we have been looking at the city shoreline as a series of reaches, and within those reaches looking at different elevations. The colors in this map are the ground surface elevations, and those ones that are in the greens are around those areas that are sort of only around present day high tide and without levees would be flooded every day. And so that makes it sort of helped us delineate which neighborhoods and areas to look at in terms of how they were connected, how low they were, and also sort of what part of the bay they faced. I'm going to talk, sort of just give a sampling of some of these adaptation measures that overlap with some more details about the ones that presented before. So for instance, this part we call Bayfront South, so the south part facing the bay. This is the plan we're working on right now with the county and with Marin Audubon for the Tiscornia Marsh project. So this project, here's an overlay of the plan, which is to sort of build out a part of the marsh, use sediment and dredge spoils around to fill it in, provide sort of some adaptation of a beach shoreline that can be a little more flexible, a little more resilient, and a little more armored to the waves that come in. And then also do some setback here in terms of the outer part of the fields. That'll be joined with the plan that Corey was talking about, the resiliency plan for Pickleweed Park as a community center that builds off of that and sort of makes the community park both active flood management happening right outside of it, as well as being sort of a focal point for community education. Along Point San Pedro Road, here's a shot down that existing levee at Point San Pedro Road. One thing you see here is this is a levee, but it's a levee that's kind of right at the end of its useful life. It's very narrow and skinny. There's not really room to build it up because of how narrow and skinny it is. The rocks are ready to keep them from rolling down or cemented in place. So that's kind of the engineer's sign of like, okay, we did what we can do right here with the existing footprint that we have. To improve it, one option would be to look at doing a flood wall, which has a very narrow footprint and continue with that, but has some issues with obscuring views and things like that. The other possibility here would be to do part of a larger sort of re-envisioning for this road. Although it's a key roadway, it is one that has 1 to 2 lanes, has wide shoulders, has a median, so there's some room to work with there. And so another opportunity would be to shift the roadway up and in as part of a plan to redevelop it, as well as looking at some low points in other areas and dealing with those that sort of connect with what Chris has been talking about, sort of providing connectivity of these key transportation corridors. In the Loch Lomond area, we've looked at that area and seen a number of opportunities there as well. Actually, in fact, the one I want to talk about is a recent one that is in line with what Paul was talking about sort of having a sea level rise layer and having people start to think about raising elevations already, which is the development that's gone there right in Bay Harbor, actually raised their lowest floors higher than what was required by just sort of the bare minimum of FEMA flood standards. So I've found in general when you've worked with developers and people who are thinking about sea level rise, that even though it does cost a little bit more in the short term, it is something that folks are willing to work with. There's like lots of the city that drains from the hillsides into these shallow areas. There's some areas sort of that get trapped behind that when it comes to stormwater runoff. So the stormwater system sort of right at the low point of the Point San Pedro road intersection already has some capacity issues draining. So with that, probably some tide gates on the culverts will help for a little bit in the short term, but in the long term, probably some pump stations like other parts of the city that have gone below the tide level. Thinking about what's the alignment to provide for coastal flood levy in the future. Right now, this area is sort of just high enough that it can eke out or build some pads for the houses in the back, but in the future we'll probably need a coastal flood levee. So in this case, like there's the nice promenade out front that provides an area as long as that's kept as open space. There's a capacity to build up there without having to relocate homes and things like that. There's a little bit of question of how do you tie it off on the sides that I think would be good for the city to identify now in terms of people make land use decisions. The breakwater was raised in the recent past, but that's one of the reasons why some of the waves don't propagate in and affect the flood measures that happen inland. So considering raising the breakwater, since it's an existing feature that's there, and help reduce the effect of waves in this part of the shoreline. And then also think about, there's quite a few places where there's sort of smaller patches of wetlands. So right at the end of the marina there, in that low-lying yellow area is a wetlands area. So thinking about, those provide value and habitat open space as well. So thinking about what are the plans to think about how can the wetlands stay as resilient as possible in the long term. For the south part of Canal, there's some adaptation measures that are sort of fixing some low spots that exist already. So this is a point at the end of Front Street where there's already sandbags out there on king tides already. You can find water coming up over this sort of an unplanned boat ramp feature that runs down. And so certainly looking at some opportunities here to add some earth and fill, which is usually cheaper in this area across the edge of the boat ramp, maybe around the corner where it's more constrained because of the existing structure, looking at some sheet pile flood wall that provides a skinnier footprint. But a really long-term challenge is particularly for the part of the canal that faces the canal where people have taken advantage of being on the waterfront. In some cases, the houses almost become the waterfront. And so these areas providing a protection mechanism with those houses right where the levees would be is obviously going to be a challenge. And so I think that's sort of a longer term effort for the city to think about. The city doesn't doesn't have an easement there, doesn't have a right of way to build or construct a levee. So it's going to be sort of on a parcel by parcel basis, because of course sort of everyone on the backside is literally in the same boat. And in order for them to sort of all benefit from protection will require coordination across and along the shoreline. In some areas like this, there's potentially opportunities for putting something like a larger tide gate or tidal barrage at the mouth, like they've done in some European cities, Venice Lagoon, the Thames. Those have become challenging to manage with dynamic sea level rise because they start to something that's a storm surge barrier and closes once in a while, but then as sea level rise comes, they're going to start closing much more and more frequently, which sometimes from an operational perspective for these huge structures becomes hard to operate. And they also have some pretty considerable factors, such as if they're closed all the time, you have to deal with the creek flow, because obviously there's San Rafael Creek is coming in the back, so you need to look at combining with a pump station. If you want to continue to have navigation access, you have to look at having a lock or some way for the boats to get past this structure there. And also you'd be sort of providing a disconnect in terms of the habitat as well that would need to be evaluated. So while the engineering structure right at the mouth may seem like a quick fix, it has implications all up and downstream that certainly need to be looked at. So that's where we're headed, is sort of to try to help provide the city with this sort of plan, as well as saying a phase plan over time, dealing with cities. The FEMA flood map shows the existing levees perhaps could even use some work on their own, but as sea level rise comes to town, thinking about, okay, where are some thresholds when we want to start planning about the next phase of our design, looking at the low spots, trying to work on these habitat projects like Tiscornia, maybe at the next level threshold, starting to look at upgrading pump stations, looking at community scale levee projects that are going to be necessary for larger amounts of sea level rise, and then thinking in the long term, how do we, as a bay-wide community as a whole, deal with storm surge, looking at bigger barriers, potentially realignment, and those sorts of things. So, thanks.
Is this, I need an HDMI cable.
Oh, are you switching it somewhere else?
I'm just gonna.
Oh, I gotcha.
Yeah, just unplug the
We have one more presentation.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. Okay. Right.
Thank God you're here. Seriously. The whole city looks pretty bad. No surprise. This is in the line, this is sitting on the dock of the bay.
Okay, there we go. Well, okay, I feel like Jimi Hendrix coming on after Pete Townsend. I guess I'm gonna have to burn my guitar after the impressive and very informative presentations by Matt and Paul and Chris and Corey. My name's Jeff Rhodes, and I'm the Executive Director of Resilient Shore. I'm fortunate also to have some of our team members here, Kathy Schaefer, who served for many years in District 9 with FEMA and is now a PhD candidate at Davis, and dealing really with issues related to flood insurance and reducing risk for flood and sea level rise. We also have Janine Pfeiffer here, who is helping us right now on our prospectus for our fundraising campaign this fall. And what I'm going to try to sort of wrap up here. You've got so much information, and I'm really concerned about information overload. But for starters, we're already kind of aware of the crisis. I don't really need to get into this, but one of the things that we really face is that we have to combine what Corey shared with us as well as whatever sort of adaptation measures we ultimately select as a community. But the fact of the matter is if we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions and find ways to sequester them, and we don't deal with adaptation, we're toast. Very soggy toast, but we're toast. So, obviously the other issue is how are we going to pay for this? And it's going to be a significant challenge with all of the other communities to find the resources to get these things done, to make the right decisions. And it's going to be very difficult, but possible for all of us with all of our own specific concerns and interests to come together as a community and come up with solutions that meet everybody's needs. So how did we get here? Well, the fact of the matter is this wonderful map is 1915, and all the areas that you see in blue are salt marsh in 1915. The upper watershed is the Las Galinas watershed, the central one is Central San Rafael, and the lower one is the Corte Madera watershed. And you can see that salt marsh extended all the way up to lower downtown San Rafael. So it shouldn't be surprising that since we've developed on these areas and these this Old Bay mud is actually consolidating and these communities are actually settling lower and lower, that it's not surprising that these areas are at flood risk. So if we look, this is Central San Rafael today, and look how it was and look how it is. And you can see that we filled all of the salt marsh and we've actually filled some of the mud flat. So it should be no surprise that we're in the fix that we're in. This map is kind of similar to Matt's in that it shows the relative elevation, and you can see all of those areas in blue would actually be flooded at high tide if it wasn't for the work that our Public Works Department does in pumping and conveying even the nuisance waters off of those sites. So it's no small wonder that those areas would flood. The area that you see in violet is actually so far below sea level at present that if you breach the levee, it would be a permanent polder. It'd have water on it all the time. And the green areas would flood at a 1% or 100-year flood event. This next slide I think is useful because it shows what our exposure is for the various different levees where we have an interface between the city and the tidal estuary or the bay itself. And all of the levees that you see in red, incidentally, this exhibit was prepared by another one of our team members, Stuart Siegel, who isn't here this evening. But all of the areas that you see in red would overtop in a 100-year flood. in some areas by as much as 5 feet. So you can see that we have a considerable amount of exposure, roughly 10 miles of exposure along either the tidal estuary or the bay itself. And as Matt mentioned, a closure at the mouth of the canal would eliminate the risk, or certainly greatly reduce it, for all of that red that you see along the canal itself. So this is our favorite segment along Point San Pedro Road, and shows how in a storm condition with elevated tides and tidal fetch, the water actually overtops the levee. This shows you what Southeast San Rafael will look like in a 100-year event. We have a significant amount of our population that is at risk, and what could happen here could be very similar to what happened in San Jose in 2017 along the Guadalupe River. We have businesses at risk. Roughly 66% of our tax revenue comes from this area that's at flood risk. We also have neighborhoods at risk. Today, in Central and East San Rafael, roughly 16,000 people live within the 100-year floodplain, including the canal neighborhoods, Spinnaker and Bay Point. And so obviously, something needs to be done even today to reduce the risk of flooding for folks that are within the 100-year floodplain. So how can we solve this problem? Well, there's some design challenges. In the first place, whatever we do needs to be environmentally compelling. We need to leave our environment in better shape than we found it. We need to find cost-effective solutions, and we also need to have local skin in the game financially if we're going to attract external resources to help our community face these challenges. The other thing that we probably will need to do as we go forward with solutions is minimize private land acquisition. And the reasons for that is that whenever you are acquiring land, you're doing something that is costly, contentious, and difficult to achieve. Look at what's happening, for example, in trying to acquire land for right-of-way for high-speed rail in the Central Valley. That would be also repeated here. So what we need to do is find ways to achieve this without acquiring a lot of private land, if we can avoid it. Clearly, for as long as we can, we'd like to maintain maritime access to the canal and Galenas Creek. And at the end of the day, we need to find solutions that we can implement on a pay-as-you-go basis. We can't afford to build something today that will carry us through to some hypothetical date long in the future simply because we don't have the capacity financially to do it. But if we design these improvements appropriately so that they can be added to incrementally in the future, that will represent an achievable solution. So let's look a little closer at the shoreline. This is looking at the shoreline along Southeast San Rafael, extending from where the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge lands here over to about the hill between Marin Yacht Club and Loch Lomond Marina. So the interesting thing, and you could see this in the topographic exhibit that I provided earlier, or showed earlier from 1915, that one of the unique features of Marin County is we have these series of valleys that are defined by topography. So we have the opportunity to build shoreline defenses that span between that topography, which gives us considerably more options that might occur in a place like Redwood City or the South Bay, where they're on an extensive plain and they have to deal with their neighbors, and so they don't have the topography where they can anchor whatever their defenses are. So looking at this, here is one of the types of solutions that Matt described, which is this notion of armoring a levee in the existing location. Now, part of the problem is the levees that we have are really berms that were constructed informally in many cases, so they don't meet current engineering standards, and we have no confidence that there won't be seepage and water infiltration underneath the levees. So we have to actually form some sort of hydrostatic curtain that goes all the way down to the appropriate geology or dense bay mud in order to actually have something that will work as there is higher and higher water on the bay side of the levee. And the other thing is that you'll notice right here, there is a potential for accommodating some sort of closure at the mouth of the canal. And as Matt observed, there are implications to that decision and the need for some sort of pumping facility. Fortunately, we're only draining about 4 square miles of land, so it's not like we're having to accommodate the Rhine River or something. The next exhibit is this notion of a horizontal levee or ecotone, and the diagram is really pretty simple-minded. It really shows salt marsh, but in fact, it could be a very sophisticated habitat with lots of different kinds of habitat conditions and differing elevations. The problem is it takes a lot of material to create this, millions of yards of bay mud that's dredged from places like the Richmond terminal. Standard Oil would be an example of where we could probably get about 25, maybe 250,000 yards of material a year. But you have to also find some way to deal with this outer edge. And the configuration of this thing has to be determined based upon all sorts of modeling for sedimentation and currents and wind. So the Tuscarnia Marsh Project serves as a wonderful beta test for this kind of thing. And the outer edge could be any of number of things. It could be a beach, it could be cobble, it could be shell, it could be some sort of groins, who knows really. The next slide shows kind of what it would look like. The upper one shows a typical armored levee. And the problem with that is that in a storm condition, you have the full depth of the water. And those wind-driven waves really run up on that shoreline. So it has to be really robust and tough to be able to withstand the forces of storm-driven fetch. The lower condition shows what a horizontal levee or ecotone levee might look like. And what happens is by raising the bay bottom, we reduce the height of the waves and reduce their fetch and mitigate a lot of the storm energy. The problem is the standing water elevation is what it is. So regardless, the inner edge of that levee has to be designed to accommodate the height of the standing water. So in a way, it's kind of combining a complex levee, engineered levee, like one that Matt described earlier, with a nature-based solution of a horizontal levee bayward of the engineered levee. And the thing is that also that all that habitat provides an opportunity for carbon sequestration, because salt marsh and its associated vegetation captures a lot of carbon. So there's a mitigation factor as well as an adaptation factor in a nature-based solution. So this kind of gives you a sense of what they look like. Obviously, armored levee on the upper photograph. The lower condition may not be technically something that was built as a horizontal levee, but that's kind of what it would look like, where you would have a hard edge that demarks the natural environment, the environment subject to flooding, from the human environment that's protected from flooding. So let's touch a bit on potential design solutions. In this area, I'm just showing you a couple of ideas. There are obviously others, and what ultimately will be selected will have to depend on a substantial amount of community input. But in the case of what you saw there with the engineered levee and the horizontal levee, they both work well together. You know, these things can be done on a pay-as-you-go basis. As one deals with sea level rise adaptation, it will be necessary to raise both up over time, so it will require continuously adding additional dredge material and raising the height of the salt marsh. In some cases, we may be fortunate to the extent that the salt marsh will tend to capture sediment in the bay water and settle it out, so it may in fact rise itself naturally. We won't really know without a considerable amount of testing and actually seeing the features in place. Next, this was prepared with Chris's group for Drawdown Marin, and it makes an interesting comparison of the relative options for how we respond to our adaptation challenge. The first is don't do anything. And the second one is this notion of managed retreat, which is kind of pick up your toys and leave. And then finally, the last is kind of a protect and defend strategy. Now, the problem is protecting and defending can't be done everywhere. It depends on the local conditions. It depends on what's at risk. It depends on the ability to pay for things, really. And they're comparing things from a standpoint of social impact, environmental impact, and financial impact. And it may be, certainly in the case of Central and South East San Rafael, that protecting and defending may be the most viable option, because we're not going to be forcing our immigrant community and our businesses to relocate. So, how do we make this stuff all happen? Well, fortunately, our Community Development Director, Paul Jensen, has, and Corey have pointed out that the general plan is already taking these things into consideration and really setting things up so that we can go forward as a community to prepare a shore resiliency plan. And the 2040 general plan update is going to do that and identify policy and action. Paul has already gone through the specific details. Clearly, we're already well known in the region as a hot spot, and the fact that we have a disadvantaged community as well as a substantial amount of critical regional infrastructure in our community will place us in a position where we can attract external resources to help solve our problems. But at the end of the day, we need to have skin in the game locally as well. We're going to have to raise funds through special improvement districts, harbor districts, geological hazard abatement districts, those sorts of investment, or rather infrastructure financing mechanisms. We will probably want to see if we can get development exactions from developers who are developing in places like Southeast San Rafael to help pay for things that we really need to do as a community. The other thing that's really critical is when we start a shore planning effort, we need to do this at a community level, and we need to engage people in the process immediately, understand the needs of the various different stakeholder groups and neighborhoods. This is not a situation where planners like me or like Matt or Paul or any of us who are professionals can come up with a solution and try to sell it to the neighborhoods and the stakeholders. We really have to identify various different options and together vet them and determine what their social, economic, and environmental impacts are, and collectively make the best decisions for our community. One of the key problems we face is that it's a lot easier to get money to do something than find money to plan to figure out what to do. And so one of our greatest challenges right now is getting the money to prepare this community-based shore plan. And fortunately, we have Marin Community Foundation. There are other regional sources of funds, and we at Resilient Shore hope to assist the city in being able to attract the resources to do this plan. So what can you all do? Well, one of the things you can do is stay informed. And if you'd like, get me your email address, and we will include you in our distribution list for our shore news, which comes out roughly quarterly. And that kind of tells folks what's going on along the shore. It's about history, it's about adaptations measures, it's about flood insurance issues. The other thing is, and the key here is, we ultimately all need to participate in the shore planning effort, because it won't be a success unless what we individually need is incorporated into it. And the other thing is there's going to have to be a bit of setting aside some of our own personal interests for the needs of all of us. And as we move forward, we need your help. We could certainly use your assistance in terms of donations to our project. And you can either ask me or find out more on our website, which is right there at the bottom. So there you have it. Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes left. I want to thank all five of our speakers. And I really appreciate that. Also, we're going to be following up with notes to everybody who signed in, and we'll include your website so that if you're interested in joining Jeff's group with their struggle or joining our group, I just wanted to tell you before I stop and turn the parole over to my colleague. One thing that the Fed does is for your neighborhoods, if you have projects, you can appeal to us, present a project, and we can fund it. So that's something that we would like to encourage you to do, becoming a member. It could be for your parks, it could be for small amounts of money for your shorelines, etc. That said, I'd like to pass this over to Ross, who's going to moderate any questions.
I have very little to say, and we'll do questions. I was just going to point out two pretty obvious things. A, it's hugely encouraging to have these incredible minds and people doing this, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's amazing to see these people that are so good at what they do, that are resources, that are working on this problem. And I sit here and I'm just like.
Yes.
The second thing is, my big takeaway is, it's all going to land on us. Right? I mean, our time, our money, our energy, our attention, our knowledge. I mean, this is something that is going to take all of us because it affects all of us. And if those are the two things you leave here with, that sets your mindset going forward about how we're going to progress through the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. I mean, this is a big deal. So with that, I would have any questions that you guys have for anybody. I'm going to start up here first.
Yes. This was a question I'm actually going to be talking about with you on Monday. And first of all, the presentations were really good and very measured and well thought out. But what happens when things like this hit, disaster and so on, we're all subject to trauma. Mm-hmm. And that has not been, from what I can see, addressed very well. I mean, fear causes freak out. Let's see, no matter how well prepared we are, trauma can throw anybody off. It can throw all the people who know what to do. It can throw them off. And in preparation to my talking with Paul about it on Monday, this is a growing area of therapeutic work. That there's a lot of therapists are finding themselves inundated with people who are really concerned about the future. I think one thing that helps, aside from the community engagement, the things that you, Jeff, talked about, the modulating the personal versus the communities is really important. But to think about, this happened about 10,000 years ago when the Ice Age ended, and we had a sea level rise at that point. And so it has happened, everybody's vulnerable, and so my question would be, has anybody out of all of these groups done much work on the psychological, emotional, traumatic side? Because I haven't seen anything yet, and that's something I would like to become involved in.